Marvel Studios, a name that will forever go down in film history as one of the most important in existence. But if it was not for a few important people related to Marvel, the studio would have faded to obscurity. So in this multi-part retrospective, I hope to inform you about everything Marvel and how they came to rule Hollywood. But before we get to Marvel as we know them today, or at Marvel Studios, we have to take a trip all the way back through time to the early 1990s. At the turn of the decade, Marvel found himself in a weird place. Their direct competitor DC Comics just came off a huge success of multiple Superman movies and just launched one of the biggest superhero franchises of all time in form of Batman '89. At the same time, Marvel was struggling to keep any property from doing anything. Captain America had multiple failed movies, Spider-Man was in turmoil on TV and on film, Doctor Strange had a movie that nobody remembers, and long gone were the days where Marvel was ruling TV with the Incredible Hulk. Now, while the live action side of things was pretty awful, there was major success going on the cartoon front. Animated series such as X-Men, Fantastic Four, and most importantly of all, Spider-Man were their keys to success. But that success was short-lived due to poor comic book sales and everything else involved with the business. And on December 27th, 1996, just a few weeks before Christmas, Marvel filed for bankruptcy. The company was losing money hand over fist, and coincidentally, one of their major debts was to Disney for $1.7 million. Over 1/3 of all the employees in Marvel were laid off that week. Lucky for them, the bankruptcy paid off all the major debts and they could refocus on the future of Marvel. And these plans were originally known as Marvel Mania, a chain of restaurants, bunch of Marvel interactive CD-ROMs, and card trading games. Unfortunately, Marvel was still thinking backwards and everything they released was a few years too late. They were forced to close down all of these within a year. With nowhere to go and comic book sales at their all-time lowest, Marvel sought to sell some of their character rights off for movies. Just 2 years into this, in 1998, we would get the first sign of Marvel coming back to life with the release of Blade. Selling the character rights off to New Line Cinema, who at the time and still works for Warner Brothers, was a huge gamble. Blade would go on to have a domestic US total of $70 million. And due to how these licenses were made, Marvel only saw $25,000 of all of its profits. Other properties which were in development hell for years, such as Spider-Man and X-Men, were sold off to Sony and Fox. Now, unlike the Blade deal, the Marvel deal with Fox actually didn't include any money, so Marvel made exactly $0 off the success of any X-Men. And this is where the studio rivalry between Marvel and Fox started. But next up on the horizon was the release of Spider-Man. The poster boy for Marvel would get an upcoming movie release, and this time they had a director and everything was set. Sam Raimi would take the helm and bring on a new generation for Marvel Comics. But before we get into Spider-Man, let's take a trip back to the beginning of the X-Men franchise to X-Men 1. Where at the time a little known person by the name of Kevin Feige was made the associate producer of the X-Men movies due to his extensive knowledge of the X-Men properties along with other Marvel Universe ties. During his time on X-Men, he managed to make a huge impression that got noticed by the newfound Marvel Studios, who was selling off all the movie rights. This studio was run by the one and only Avi Arad, who contacted Kevin Feige and gave him a job. After Kevin Feige was hired as the second in command of the brand new Marvel Studios, their next task was to look at Spider-Man 2 along with Sam Raimi. Kevin being put in charge and being named the executive producer of Spider-Man 2 along with Marvel Studios and Avi Arad, they had way more of a hand in structuring this movie. And this is where he started to form friendships and partnerships with the people at Sony. One such person being Sony's Amy Pascal, who oversaw the Spider-Man franchise and the distribution and products. Years after all of this would be happening, we would go on to learn that Kevin Feige already had some great ideas that did not come to fruition. We would go on and learn that after the production of X-Men 2, which he was the co-producer on, he managed to contact Hugh Jackman and even get him to agree to make a cameo as Wolverine in Spider-Man 2. This was quickly squashed by Fox and thus started the even worse blood between the two rival studios. But Kevin Feige did manage to get one Easter egg in there, which is something that was a passion project of his that was in development since 1998, and he was heavily involved with it. And that was Doctor Strange, but we'll talk about that at a later date. Now, with the success of all of these Marvel movies, not even under the Marvel Studios banner, in 2003, Marvel's David Measle came up with an idea. Why not stop selling all of our characters and focus on the ones we have? And his idea was simple. Let's create our own production studio. Let's develop our movies under our own in-house brand, and we can retain 100% of the profits. And given that this was 2003 and making a comic book movie was still sort of worrisome, Marvel decided to pass on this idea. And this was mainly due to the fact that for the first time in a decade, selling their characters and even making a small profit off the action figures and comics that were being based on the movies was finally giving them some money. They did not want to risk it all starting their own studio and not even owning any of their biggest brands such as the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, and Spider-Man. Now, despite Marvel not wanting to move on with a cinematic universe, David Measle was still very persistent at his goal. And his main argument was, if we produce an Iron Man movie or a Captain America and the movie fails, we can't really be worse off than we already are selling everything off to other studios and making no profit. Which brings us to the most important year in Marvel Comics history, which is 2005. That year, the Marvel board approved Measle's plan for a 7-year deal worth $225 million, and this would be used to finance a handful of movies. What was special about this was that this was an independent film company. They would not have to be slaves to anybody, and they could do whatever they wanted. At the same time, they went out to Paramount and reached a distribution deal with Paramount Pictures to be able to put their movies out into theaters. If they did not start Marvel Studios at this exact time, Captain America was in limbo of being sold to Warner Brothers. Except there was one condition with this giant Marvel deal. Marvel would have to somehow put up enough collateral to match $225 million. And they did just that. They put up every single major property they had remaining. These 10 properties would include Captain America, The Avengers, Nick Fury, Black Panther, Ant-Man, Cloak and Dagger, Doctor Strange, Hawkeye, Power Pack, and Shang-Chi. And here's the real big kicker. If this plan failed, Marvel Studios would lose the ownership of every single one of these characters. Now, despite all the risks, Marvel already had one goal: build up everything towards the ultimate culmination of everything they could put on the line with the Avengers. But they realized that the crowds were not ready for a giant team-up, and that the crowds would turn away if they did not understand who these characters were. Since at this time Captain America has already had a few TV movies that bombed, they figured we can't go with Captain America again. Thor, relatively unknown, so we can't use that. The Hulk, which we will talk about at a later date, was already stuck at Universal with that license about to lapse. But this is when Marvel noticed that something interesting was happening. One of their missing franchises, which wasn't on the list, was of course Iron Man. So where was Iron Man? Well, he was stuck in development hell over at New Line Cinema, which is owned by Warner Brothers, and that license was about to lapse. So 2 months passed since the original Marvel inception of the MCU and the Marvel Shared Universe and Marvel Studios idea was born. They waited and they regained the rights to Iron Man. Now, since Iron Man was not originally included in the $525 million deal, Marvel would have to finance the movie all by themselves. And Marvel decided to do just that, mainly because he's the only character that they owned the rights to that had a big enough star power that they could promote, and it's something that didn't exist so far, and it's a character that, unlike Captain America, hasn't been represented in live action yet. In November of 2005, Marvel Studios officially announced that their first movie would be Iron Man. When they went out there to try to hire writers, they pitched a character in the movie to about 30 writers who all passed on it. Many saying that this was going to be a dead end and one of the biggest box office flops in existence. For a while there, everything went silent up until April 2006, where director Jon Favreau was officially hired by Marvel Studios. Jon Favreau, years after working with Avi Arad already on the production of Daredevil, was interested in doing more comic book things, and this time he would also take on a physical role as being Iron Man's butler and bodyguard, aka Happy Hogan. Now, Jon Favreau had one idea when they set out to make Iron Man: make it realistic and make it believable, and he used Batman Begins, the most recent Batman interpretation, as an inspiration. And his original idea was that he wanted to make Iron Man a story about an adult man who is literally reinventing himself from the ground up after he realizes that the world is not what it seems because he's been ignoring it. Another important element that would become a mainstay in the Marvel Universe was to make sure that the characters were aged appropriately, so he took the original version, which was of course set in Vietnam, and made it set in modern day Afghanistan. Now, before the movie ever started shooting, there were quite a few rumors and quite a few people were interested in playing the role of Tony Stark. Now, before the role would inevitably go to Robert Downey Jr. and save his career and literally reinvent him from the ground up just like Iron Man, there was two other people who screen tested but ended up passing up on the role. The first being Nicolas Cage, who ended up not taking it so he could go produce Ghost Rider for Sony. And the second choice was one of the hottest names in Hollywood, who was Tom Cruise. Now, despite being the star of the movie and of course getting the largest billing in the future of the MCU, Robert Downey Jr. did not actually make as much money as the actual co-star of the movie, Terrence Howard, who was reportedly paid more than 3 times of what Robert Downey Jr. made. Now, with the two main stars of the movie set, they would need someone to co-star along with them. Enter Gwyneth Paltrow, who is of course going to play Pepper Potts, the assistant to Tony Stark. Now that all the actors and everything was set, there was one major problem holding everything back: the villain, as Jon Favreau did not think that Iron Man had many suitable villains, and specifically that the Mandarin would not work as the first villain of the movie. And this was definitely something that Jon Favreau agreed upon, because once he got talked to Mark Millar, who is responsible for writing some of the top comics at Marvel at the time, he felt that the character would be too cheesy and that they would have to alter the tone in a future movie. After that meeting, Marvel and Jon Favreau made the decision to actually use the character much like a Sauron character or Emperor Palpatine in Star Wars, make his presence felt in the background, and never show this character on screen. And their presence can of course be felt throughout the entirety of the movie, as the Ten Rings make numerous appearances and are in the background, and they definitely have their presence felt. And this would also start a long-standing tradition of loading the Marvel movies with various Easter eggs. Now, Jon Favreau was also a fan of having Iron Man face someone that is formidably bigger and stronger than him, and the choice was made to make Obadiah Stane the villain of the movie, once Jeff Bridges was cast, of course. This was also another way that they could make it a personal story for Tony Stark's history and family involvement, which they would go on to touch upon in the film, and another way to ground the film and not go too science fiction. Now, originally Marvel intended Obadiah Stane to be the villain for the second movie after they developed that relationship for a while, but instead they decided to go back to the scripts and take out the Crimson Dynamo, who was the villain of the movie up until this point. And as a comic book fan, another Easter egg that Jon Favreau wanted to make sure he put in there was of course the 2 call signs of the attack jets that are chasing Iron Man, which were named Whiplash 1 and Whiplash 2. Which were obviously references to the character of Whiplash, who would go on to be the villain of the second movie. Now, another Easter egg that Marvel wanted to make sure was in there to kind of hint towards the future on what the idea of the franchise was going to be was of course including Captain America's shield in Tony Stark's workshop. Now, when production on this movie started, there was a lot of discussion on what the movie would be about and where it would take place. Jon Favreau was adamant that the movie does not take place on the East Coast, specifically New York, because he was sick of seeing New York and that location in every other comic book movie. So for this reason, the West Coast was chosen. So with all the actors set, filming on the movie began on March 12th, 2007. Which was just a little bit over 12 months close to the release date of the movie. And the first leg of shooting would actually take place in some caves, where they actually shot Tony Stark being captured by the Afghanistan soldiers, and of course how he comes up with the Iron Man Mark I. And since the caves were obviously located in the desert, the exterior shots of Afghanistan were actually shot at the Olanka sand dunes. And the exterior shots that were shot there were done across 2 days, where many of the crew were bothered by the 40 to 60 mile per hour winds, where after that they would finish off some of the shooting at the local Edwards Air Base beginning in mid-April. And then of course there's the exterior shots of the Stark home, which were digitally added to Point Doom in Malibu. Now, Iron Man 1 is notable for being one of the biggest productions in Hollywood to actually not have a finished script. A lot of the stuff that they were doing was just ad-libbed and off the top of their heads, trying to match it up with what the scenes were actually going to be. And for this, the movie gets a lot of credit for feeling so natural and so human. Filming of Iron Man actually concluded on June 25th of 2007 at the Caesars Palace in Las Vegas, Nevada. In Vegas is where they shot a majority of the ending fight, which would also include another notable Easter egg, which was the Roxxon Corporation. The Roxxon Corporation would go on to show up in various things from Netflix to Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. to other Marvel movies. Now, Jon Favreau has stated many times that he was shocked that he was actually able to keep the movie on schedule because he was not a guy to do action. Now, after the shooting was wrapped, Brian Michael Bendis, who's of course one of the writers for many Marvel comics and just so happens to be one of the leads of everything in Marvel now, was actually brought in to write a bunch of dialogue that would be suitable for Nick Fury. Now, this was of course just kept secret, and they would shoot the cameo to attach on to the end of the movie. Unfortunately, even with a small skeleton crew shooting the scenes, the rumors still got out there that Nick Fury was going to be included in the movie somehow. Kevin Feige then had the bright idea to remove the scene from the movie and actually include it at the end of the post-credits. So only the true fans that sat to the end and might have heard about this online were the ones to be rewarded with the Avengers initiative. Now, Nick Fury was initially chosen to actually be portrayed by Samuel L. Jackson because originally when Marvel launched the Marvel Ultimates comics line, they actually went to Sam Jackson and asked for his likeness for the comic book. Now, when it came to the soundtrack of Iron Man, there was one obvious choice to go with for Marvel, and their pick was Ramin Djawadi, who is of course most famously now known for the Game of Thrones theme. Now, after he was chosen, Marvel felt that they also needed another bigger name attached to the soundtrack, thus Hans Zimmer was added. And some of his most notable work would be the soundtrack to the Dark Knight trilogy. So with Marvel wrapping up everything and being in post-production of the movie, their first big chance to make an impression was going to be San Diego Comic-Con 2007. This would be the first big reveal of what was happening with Iron Man. Jon Favreau and Robert Downey Jr. took it to the Marvel stage to reveal the Iron Man Mark I to the crowds waiting. And later on, they would be hosting a panel which would give us the first look at the trailer, which was not made public ever, but unfortunately to them and fortunately to us, on September 9th of 2007, that trailer leaked. I remember the day very well, considering I've been waiting to see what this movie was going to look like with my life, and my best friend at the time, Andy, was making fun of me, saying that this was going to be the biggest flop ever since nobody knew who the character was. Much like the reaction of most of the people at the time on MySpace, which coincidentally enough actually gets a mention in the opening montage scene in the movie. So after the whole San Diego Comic-Con thing, we would officially get Iron Man to hit theaters on April 14th, 2008 to a press screening. The buzz and the premiere was very well received, and the crowds waited to witness what the movie was going to hold. On May 2nd, 2008, Iron Man would release to the United States, and that weekend would go on to make $98 million. And would have a global finish in box office with $582.2 million. Iron Man was now a grade A level star, beating previous record holders like Batman. Not only did the movie do successful in box office take, it also did amazingly well with critics, and currently stands tied for #1 spot for the best comic book superhero movie of all time. The film would also go on to be nominated for various Movie of the Year awards. And during the Saturn Awards of 2009, it would win the Best Science Fiction Film. And as was common back in the day, of course the movie got a video game tie-in to release in the same week that the movie would come out in the United States. The game was published by Sega and released on the PlayStation 2, 3, the PSP, the Wii, Nintendo DS, Xbox 360, the mobile phone, and Windows PC. The game was mainly played from the third person, meaning over the shoulder, having every level within it be open world so you can do anything the way you saw fit. The video game did try to stick as close as possible to the plot of the movie as they could, as obviously Sega did not get the full plot, so spoilers could be prevented. and upon the game's release it received mostly negative reviews, sitting around a 44 out of 100 on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, with the versions that predating those doing far worse and having way more problems that included graphical glitches, controls, and various other game-breaking bugs. The only positive that most of the critics had to say about the game was the fact that the graphics were pretty decent on the current gen consoles, meaning the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 version, and the Iron Man armor looked awesome. And there was also a hint of the MCU connection between this game and the Incredible Hulk, which would come out just a few months later, which I will of course talk about at a later date. But if you did end up having the Incredible Hulk game and you had a save for Iron Man 1 on your console, you were able to unlock the Hulkbuster suit. So after the success of Iron Man 1, one thing was clear, that this was about to become a giant franchise and that the sky is the limit when it comes to Marvel Comics and their properties on the big screen. Later on the following year, Jon Favreau would of course be back to start directing Iron Man 2, but not before a major change and a major seismic shift would be felt throughout the entire industry of Hollywood and comics, when Disney decided to buy Marvel Comics. The purchase was made on August 31st, 2009. This date would forever change the course of Marvel Entertainment and Marvel Studios and where they go on from here. So tune in for part 2 of this series, where we are going to see an incredible universe start to take shape. After the huge success of Iron Man, which took the world by storm, it was time to look at the next hero that would be joining the Marvel Cinematic Universe lineup. This was of course Universal Studios' Hulk, or should I say the Incredible Hulk, which is heavily influenced by the TV show of the same name. But before we can get into talking about the Incredible Hulk, we need to take a trip back in the time machine all the way to 2003, with the release of Ang Lee's Hulk, which in that point was in development at Universal Movies for 13 years, and was not actually part of the bankruptcy deal that would have seen Marvel sell all of their important characters to other studios. So the contractual obligations for the Hulk were very different. Studios like Fox with the X-Men franchise and Spider-Man over at Sony have a certain amount of time that they have to produce a movie in or lose all licenses. Pre-production on the Incredible Hulk, which would be the sequel to Ang Lee's Hulk, started right around the time the first movie was released in 2003. Through the early process of developing this movie, a few of the things that were mentioned was bringing in General Thunderbolt Ross in some sort of major capacity. Also using the villain's Abomination and the leader was a mandate. The studio this time was interested in an actual threat for the Hulk and not just him running from a bunch of humans and military equipment. Avi Arad, Marvel Studios, and Universal now set a date of May 2005 for the release of the Hulk 2. That date came and went, and on January 18th, 2006, Avi Arad confirmed that Marvel Studios would be providing all the money to produce The Incredible Hulk. The only difference that The Incredible Hulk would see would be that it's not distributed by Paramount. It is instead going to be distributed and held on to by Universal Pictures. And because Universal missed the deadline to put out the movie, Marvel had more say in what was going to happen with it, so they decided to actually ditch the Ang Lee version and retrofit the movie to now be part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Kevin Feige at this time would of course start headlining everything Marvel Studios was doing, and he was adamant that the next movie cannot feel like an Ang Lee movie, that one felt like a parallel universe one-shot and they could not recreate the same thing again. Moving on with Hulk 2, as was now known as The Incredible Hulk, a movie that would be a reboot of the character, Marvel approached TV and movie director Louis Leterrier, who had previously took meetings on with Marvel to direct Iron Man, but since he did not get that one, they saw fit to give him the Hulk. Louis Leterrier himself being a giant fan of the Hulk cartoon and also the live-action TV show, they thought he was a perfect fit. During the initial meeting, Leterrier was very reluctant to take on the Hulk because he was afraid he could not replicate Ang Lee's style. It was only after they reassured him that this would be his own take and his own vision on it based on Jeff Loeb's and Tim Sale's Hulk Grey that he took on directing duties. Leterrier was notorious on the set and the directing room while storyboarding, taking the exact storyboards and matching it up to the panels from the comic books. During pre-production, he also had a major push on making sure that the Hulk was represented in the same light as Bruce Banner, aka equally. He wanted to fully explore who Bruce Banner was, the inner struggle and the monster that is inside of him. Along with Kevin Feige, the two agreed that the elements of this movie would be about the injustice and the bullying of having someone like that inside of you, having all that power and strength inside of you and not realizing what you could do with it if you just happen to snap. Zach Penn, who actually worked on the original movie and has been working on various Hulk scripts from 1996, was actually brought on to look at this and try to figure out how the story would go. Tonally, they wanted it to be similar to the TV show, but at the time they were still playing with the idea, could it be a sort of requel, aka sequel, and a reboot to Hulk 2003? And some of those elements were kept in the final movie. Now, two scenes that were always prominent in his scripts that he wanted to keep did finally make an appearance in this movie, and those were Bruce Banner jumping from the helicopter to trigger his transformation, and the realization that he cannot actually make love to Betty because of the rage inside of him. Over the course of the next year and a half, various other writers and script treatments by Zach Penn and other people were submitted to Marvel. Finally, in November of 2006, a June 13th, 2008 release was set. This would place the film only a couple of months after the Marvel Studios' first outing, which would be Iron Man. And the only thing that they decided to keep that was similar to the first movie that Ang Lee directed was the fact that at the end of that movie, we see that Bruce Banner is hiding in South America, and when this movie opens up, Bruce Banner is in the same predicament. Filming of The Incredible Hulk started on July 9th, 2007. Leterrier, being the trooper that he is, actually directed the movie with 4 different units with a broken foot. He made sure he was there every day and oversaw every single stage of the film. Right off the bat, they actually went to shoot in Toronto because David Miller, who is a giant Hulk fan and also happened to be the mayor, promised to be very helpful when they had to close down an entire street to shoot the Hulk and Blonsky fight, which would double for, of course, New York. Toronto was also used for various other things, such as the Culver University battle, which happens to take place in the school and outside of it. Also, the factory we see in the movie that is supposed to be in Brazil was actually a factory in Hamilton, Ontario, which was actually due to be demolished, so they used that for the interior scenes. Along with that, they also did shoot 1 week in New York City and 2 weeks in Rio de Janeiro for the opening sequences of the movie. Now, when it came to the movie, one thing was clear that Marvel wanted. They did not want to retell the origin of the Hulk, so that was actually condensed into the opening sequence of the movie. And that sequence just so happens to be loaded with a few Easter eggs. The first one being that S.H.I.E.L.D. does have devices to take out the Hulk, which were the property of Stark Industries. And the second, a mention of Rick Jones, who is an associate of Bruce Banner, aka Atom Bomb. There is also a notable Easter egg that was removed in the original cut of the movie. As it opens up, we see that Bruce Banner is about to take his life. He ends up taking a gun and shooting himself in the head. As the camera pans away, we actually see Captain America's shield frozen in ice. This would of course go on and be changed due to the fact that he wasn't actually on top of the ice, but more inside of an actual vehicle. Now, when it came to bringing the Hulk to life, Leterrier decided to cite Andy Serkis's motion capture of Gollum and King Kong as his inspiration for the Green Monster. Edward Norton and other people would do the motion capture for the Hulk, trying to convey the human emotion. Between Edward Norton, who was the Hulk, and Roth, who was of course Abomination, they did over 2,500 different motion capture takes of what the monsters would do during a giant battle. Now, since this was a joint partnership between Marvel Studios and Universal, there were a few disagreements before the movie would officially start shooting. Universal thought that you would need as big of a name as possible to be the Hulk, so they wanted Edward Norton, who was quite a big star at the time. Marvel Studios, on the other hand, had their #1 pick, who was Mark Ruffalo. He unfortunately did not end up getting the role at this time, but that would change in the future. Once the movie was in post-production, a lot of material ended up going to the cutting room floor. Close to 70 minutes have never seen the light of day, much of which included fully shot and edited versions of the origin, and this is where the problems with the movie started to take shape, because Edward Norton was told that all the character development and depth would be kept in the final cut. Once this was apparent that this was not the case, Edward Norton refused to do any public marketing for the movie. So during The Incredible Hulk, we actually see quite a few mentions of the bigger Marvel universe. We see that S.H.I.E.L.D. is mentioned multiple times. The first time we actually see their equipment is of course by Stark Industries, and S.H.I.E.L.D. is the one funding some of the equipment that Thunderbolt Ross is using. And of course, quite possibly the biggest Easter egg in the movie is the serum that they give Emil Blonsky. This serum was another prototype and a derivative of the same thing that was given to the super soldier known as Captain America. And as it transforms each person differently, if you are a terrible person, you will look terrible. Thus, we got the Abomination. Now, speaking of the Super Soldier Serum, that is actually how the Hulk became the Hulk in the MCU. Bruce Banner was originally working on the derivative of the Captain America formula, which went wrong and ended up turning him into the Green Monster. So instead of using the atom bomb, which of course is known from the comic books, they decided to take the TV show route. Now, in hopes of setting up a future sequel, we actually got to see a little Easter egg with Samuel Stearns, who actually gets knocked into some equipment and a little bit of juice ends up dripping on his head. This was of course a hint towards him becoming the leader. To this day in the MCU, we still do not know anything about his whereabouts. Now, while trying to build this giant Marvel universe, they also needed someone that could play Thunderbolt Ross. William Hurt would end up taking on that role, and he would come back in a future movie. But his most important scene doesn't even come during the actual course of the movie itself. Kevin Feige, seeing the light at the end of the tunnel and what the Marvel Universe could be, decided to throw another Easter egg. This time not at the end of the credits, but right at the end of the movie. Robert Downey Jr., being thankful that someone gave him a chance after his battle with drugs and his subsequent career demise, owed a favor to Marvel Studios, and he agreed to make an uncredited cameo in The Incredible Hulk as Tony Stark. And he also agreed that upon advertising his own movies, such as Iron Man, that he would go out there and advertise some of Marvel's other movies, such as Hulk. And along with that, the cameos you would expect in a Marvel movie were there. Stan Lee made a brief cameo, and Lou Ferrigno did appear in the movie as a security guard, and he did voice the Hulk. The movie would end up releasing on June 13th, 2008, and it definitely did not set the box office world on fire. On a budget of $150 million, it only managed to make $263 million. But Marvel saw this as a victory. The Hulk was back home, and the movie was another step towards building a giant shared universe. And the Hulk would definitely be back in the future. Now, as was the deal with Iron Man back in the day, Sega did also produce an Incredible Hulk video game to tie in with the movie. The game would see a release right alongside the movie, releasing on Windows PC, Nintendo DS, PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, the Wii, and the Xbox 360. It was an open world game much like Hulk Ultimate Destruction, where you could just run around and destroy anything you saw fit. Now, while the game was not perfect, it did do far better than the Iron Man game when it came to reviews. And if you had a save for the other game, you could actually get a nice costume bonus. So the Hulk now had a video game and a movie, so now it was time to see what was next. And the Hulk would have to pay back a favor owed to Tony Stark by making a small cameo appearance in Iron Man 2. The original intent for Iron Man was to make a trilogy, with Obadiah Stane reprising his role from the first movie as the Ironmonger. Monger was actually used in the first movie with the idea of setting up the Mandarin for the second one. Unfortunately, they did not go with that either, due to the fact that they felt it was still too soon to reveal the Mandarin behind everything. Jon Favreau said it would be like using the Return of the Jedi in Empire Strikes Back. It just wouldn't make sense to condense the story into one. But one thing was for certain, after the inclusion of S.H.I.E.L.D. in the first Iron Man, Jon Favreau wanted the S.H.I.E.L.D. organization to have a major role in the second movie. And coming off the heels of Iron Man 1, many fans, including myself, were wondering what was the next chapter that they were going to tell. Jon Favreau said that they would explore Stark's alcoholism, but they would not adopt the demon in a bottle, which was one of the alternate scripts for the first Iron Man that they decided not to go with. And during the promoting of the first movie, Jon Favreau and Robert Downey Jr. would both cite the demon in a bottle and Stark's alcohol problems as one of the major factors of the character. but something they also did not want to explore due to the age of the character, because they believed that he would become a full-on alcoholic if this was the case in real life. So the way they decided to put pressure on Tony Stark and kind of hit upon the alcoholism was of course the end of the first movie, where he reveals his identity as Iron Man to the entire world. Another interesting thing they wanted to do was explore Pepper Potts moving away from Tony Stark and getting a boyfriend to see how unstable Tony would get. While ticking away at the early drafts of Iron Man 2, Robert Downey Jr. and Jon Favreau had help from Shane Black, who would go on to direct Iron Man 3. During the course of Iron Man 2, he suggested that they do the Destroyer of Worlds style storyline, based on J. Robert Oppenheimer, who of course worked on the Manhattan Project. Now, right after the release of the original Iron Man movie, Marvel Studios announced the development of Iron Man 2, and they set the release date for the movie for April 30th, 2010. In July of 2008, right after Iron Man left theaters and San Diego Comic-Con, it was announced after numerous negotiations that Jon Favreau would officially be returning to direct Iron Man 2. That same month, it was also announced that Jason Therex would be writing the first script. He was chosen primarily as a recommendation by Robert Downey Jr., who had previously worked on him on Tropic Thunder. While work on the script and the storyboards continued, in October of 2008, Marvel Studios made an agreement to film Iron Man 2 as well as their next 3 big franchise movies in Manhattan Beach, California. And just a few days after this, the Marvel Cinematic Universe would see their major first piece of recasting. Going on to replace Terrence Howard as James Rhodes, aka War Machine, would be Don Cheadle. Now, to this day, we still do not know exactly what happened with this. Terrence Howard has said, and I quote, "There was no explanation. Apparently the contracts that were written and signed weren't worth the paper they were printed on." It is interesting to note though that Terrence Howard was the highest billed person on the first Iron Man movie, making even more than Robert Downey Jr. Entertainment Weekly did go on to say that Jon Favreau did not enjoy working with Terrence Howard, often having to reshoot multiple scenes, and actually ended up cutting a lot of the stuff that the actor has done for the first movie. Now, the story also got a little bit murky when it was reported that Marvel did actually go back to negotiations with him, as he was the highest paid and they wanted him back, but apparently it was Howard's agents that actually stopped responding to Marvel. To this day, we will never probably know the truth. But in 2013, Terrence Howard did actually go publicly on to say that Robert Downey Jr. took the money that was supposed to go to me and pushed me out. Now, during this stage of development, the script was still not finished, and there was a few ideas being tossed around by Marvel Studios. Originally, for the first Iron Man movie, there was an Easter egg which included Fin Fang Foom. But the idea was ultimately abandoned for going to a more realistic sort of villain once again. A few months later, in January 2009, rumors hit the internet that Mickey Rourke and Sam Rockwell entered negotiations to play the 2 main villains of the feature film. A couple of days would go by and Sam Rockwell would reveal to the world that he has in fact taken the role of Justin Hammer for Marvel Studios' upcoming movie. Also saying that it was a no-brainer since he was originally one of the 3 runner-ups to play Tony Stark in the first movie, and he was very bummed when he didn't get it, so he wanted to jump on the chance of being in the franchise. After this, Paul Bettany would go on to confirm that he is in fact going to be returning to voice Jarvis. A few days later, we got confirmation that Emily Blunt entered negotiations to play the Black Widow. She was unable to take the role due to previous commitments in Gulliver's Travels. The decision to make Black Widow a part of the movie was a late addition, as the movie was in development for about 6 years at New Line Cinema, with David Hayter, aka Solid Snake from the Metal Gear Solid video games, attached to actually be the one to make it. And during the development of that movie, he even had a daughter who he named Natasha after Black Widow. Another character that Marvel Studios, Jon Favreau, and Robert Downey Jr. agreed needed to make another appearance in this and have an extended role would be Samuel L. Jackson, of course reprising his role as Nick Fury. At the time, Samuel Jackson was unsure if he was going to be returning as Nick Fury due to some breakdowns in negotiations and how the contracts were structured. About a month or so later, we would get official confirmation in February 2009 that Samuel Jackson and Marvel have reached terms, and he would be reprising his role in up to 9 upcoming movies. With everything starting to take shape, the movie almost lost its main villain, as Mickey Rourke was about to walk away from the movie for only being offered $250,000. But Marvel, not wanting to lose Mickey Rourke, decided to raise the offer and signed him on in March 2009. As soon as that announcement hit, another one followed. Later that same day, we learned that Scarlett Johansson has officially signed on to play the Black Widow. And in the report, it was stated that Black Widow and Scarlett Johansson would both be reprising their role in future movies, with the option to one of those movies potentially include the Avengers. And in April, right as principal photography was beginning, Clark Gregg, Agent Coulson, and Kate Mara both joined the project. With the release of the movie only about 10 months away, the pressure was on for Marvel Studios to deliver a follow-up to a movie that nobody thought would be successful. The bulk of the production did take place in California, but some of the other locations were of course the Edwards Air Force Base, which was used also in the first movie. Jon Favreau said that the Air Force Base was a major advantage because it gave you a real-world feel and you didn't have to do set design. Now another bulk of the production would also happen at the Downey Studios location. Now one of the most memorable scenes in the movie, which was of course the 2009 Monaco Grand Prix, was originally intended to be shot on location prior to the race. Despite being awarded the grant to actually shoot there, this was retracted days before shooting was about to start. Marvel Studios, being on short notice, decided to keep this sequence as they felt that it was important to what was happening. Storyboarding and everything was done, all the actors being set to report to set. They chose to construct the Monaco Grand Prix race at the Downey Studios lot. Later on, a few months into already shooting the movie, John Slattery was added as Howard Stark, the father of Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark, and Olivia Munn was added in an unspecified mystery role, which the internet believed was to be Scarlet Witch. To create the giant look for the Stark Expo, Marvel actually used Sepulveda Dam, constructing giant green screens from hundreds of stacked shipping containers. For the interior shots of the Stark Expo, they actually managed to use a local school. The filming of Iron Man 2 lasted an incredible 71 days, with production wrapping on July 18, 2009. And at the same time, the internet got wind of some rumors that a post-credit scene was being taped that would include a large hammer scene in the desert, which was a direct connection to their next movie, Thor. Now that the movie was in production, the studio needed the best they could get, and they got the Industrial Light and Magic guys to create the visual effects for the bulk of Iron Man 2. Now for the Iron Man suits, they decided to do it completely different than the first movie. During the shooting of the first movie, there were actual giant physical suits that were there on set that actors and stunt doubles would have to wear. For the second movie, Industrial Light and Magic would actually create entire CG characters, but the actors would wear what they called football suits, which were generally just gimped down versions of what they had in the movie, with a lot of motion and CG capture technology on them. Marvel already having experience with this due to the Incredible Hulk, it was really a no-brainer to start doing it like that. Now deep into post-production, it was revealed that Olivia Munn's original role, whatever it was cut, and she was given a new role that would only make a small appearance for about 3 seconds in the movie. And this all happened in February, just a couple of months before the official release of the movie during the reshoots. Now the soundtrack for Iron Man 2 was very important to Marvel, and they decided to feature AC/DC right on the cover and prominently throughout the movie. And at this time we would also find out that the post-credits scene was directed by Thor's own Kenneth Branagh. Now while everything seemed to be going good for the production of Iron Man 2, this was not the case, as the previous year during the post-production stage of Iron Man 2 in 2009, on August 31st, the internet and the world got the major breaking news that Disney has officially bought everything Marvel Comics for $4 billion. This included creative rights and the ability to do whatever they wanted with the upcoming movies, the ones that were in production, post-production, and the ones that had yet to be made. Now Disney originally said that their idea was to pretty much use the over 5,000 characters that they had at their disposal to be able to produce new action figures, new cartoons based on their most popular characters, brand new video games, and they even said if Pixar saw an interest in producing something Marvel, they could totally do it. But with the success of Iron Man 1, there was already an idea that Marvel had to produce brand new animated TV series based on the characters that are going to be getting standalone movies. Thor was already in development, and Iron Man came out with Iron Man Armored Adventures. The TV series was quite a deviation from what the fans saw in the recent movie. For starters, everybody including Tony Stark, Pepper Potts, and War Machine were all based in high school. The TV series did go on to have a total of 52 episodes, and was highly successful in merchandise and selling off the rights to other TV stations to show it on Saturday mornings, such as the CW. But back on the movie front, there wasn't as much success. Disney, feeling that their $4 billion buyout gave them a say in what to do, they decided to go in and start re-editing the cut of Iron Man 2 that was seen. Mickey Rourke was very committed to the role, and he decided to actually put himself into certain situations to try to really get how the character would be portrayed. Over 30 minutes of character development with him and Justin Hammer were cut from the final movie. Certain scenes that alluded more towards Tony Stark being an alcoholic were entirely removed from the final cut. And during many of the reshoots, Disney felt the need to build up the next upcoming franchise movies such as Captain America and Thor, so more references and Easter eggs were added throughout the course of the film. And much like the first movie, there was inevitably going to be a video game published by Sega once again. And while the game was a marginal improvement from the original, it still left a lot to be desired. The game would go on to have an average of a 60 out of 100. And would see the release on the PlayStation 3, the Wii, the Xbox 360, the PSP, the DS, the iPhone, and the BlackBerry. As the games were not canon to the actual storyline that was happening in the movies, they were able to take liberties, so we saw the SHIELD helicarrier, we saw Crimson Dynamo, and we even got to see AIM. Overall, I think it is a pretty fun game to play despite its glitchiness, and I did actually enjoy having a good time with it. I would recommend it if you are a hardcore fan and just want to play something that might be fun but a tad bit buggy and can completely crash on you. And finally came the day, May 7th, 2010. Under the new leadership of Disney, Iron Man 2 was released worldwide. And immediately critics and fans alike took note of some of the problems with the movie. The underdeveloped and rushed plot of the villains was completely something that Disney had a hand in destroying. The numerous forced Easter eggs and references to future Marvel movies just did not belong and felt like they weren't organically added. Unlike the first Iron Man movie, which still has one of the highest comic book film review scores to date and it sits tied for the #1 spot, Iron Man 2 was much more disliked by the critics, getting an average of a 7 out of 10. Perhaps it was the movie's expectations that it couldn't live up to the glory of the first movie, but I think in time people have gone back on it, much like myself, and found way more things that we love than hate about it. At the end of the day, the critical reviews did not do much to impact the success of Iron Man 2. Produced on a budget of $200 million, the movie would go on to make $623 million worldwide, and would go on to be one of the highest DVD and Blu-ray releases that year on all the charts. Now, once again, towards the end of the movie, we would have a special treat that involved Nick Fury and the Avenger Initiative. Quite a few Easter eggs were added towards the end of the movie. There is a scene where we see Tony Stark and Nick Fury talking, and right behind them we see that the area where Wakanda would be located is highlighted. We also see that the trajectory of where Captain America's last sighting was is also one of the points of interest. Another one also points to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean to Atlantis, but nothing has come of that yet. And the one that would make everything official that the Hulk was part of the MCU was the same news report that we saw during the Incredible Hulk appearing right on the screen, confirming that Universal Studios' Hulk was in fact going to be tied into the Avengers and the overall grand scheme to build the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So join me for part 3 of this ongoing retrospective, where we will look at the first Avenger take his first step into the world of Marvel Comics, and his inevitable tie and connection to the God of Thunder. So with the early stages of the Marvel Cinematic Universe starting to take shape, our next major franchise would be Thor. coming at us in 2011. But before we can get into talking about Thor, we are going to go back to a familiar face, one that is known for his great Spider-Man works, this of course being Sam Raimi. Sam Raimi at the time, in late 1990, after the release of Darkman, actually got to sit down with Stan Lee and pitched him and 20th Century Fox his idea of a Thor film. Unfortunately, none of these talks went anywhere, and the film was pretty much abandoned up until April of 1997. And due to Marvel's bankruptcy, we got to see some of the most famous characters such as the X-Men, Spider-Man, and the Fantastic Four sold off. Next up was going to be Thor. Thor sat around on the wayside for a little bit of time, up until the 2000 release of the original X-Men movie. Excited by the prospect of having Thor appear in a movie, there was actually going to be a made-for-TV film which was going to be on UPN. Excited by the prospect of having Thor appear in a film on TV, a script was ordered. And they already had an actor in mind. Taylor Mane, who played Sabretooth recently in X-Men 1, was asked to star as the God of Thunder. With all this excitement surrounding Thor, in May of 2000, Marvel actually brought in Artisan Entertainment to help finance the film. And after this, another 4 years would go by till we would hear something else happening with the movie. Unfortunately, no studio was willing to give them a shot. In the early months of 2004, we would actually get the news that Sony Pictures Entertainment has actually purchased the film rights, and in December of 2004, David S. Goyer was in negotiations to write and direct the movie. David Goyer at this point has worked on numerous Marvel projects, one specifically being Doctor Strange, but we'll talk about that later. A year or so later, we actually got the news that David Goyer was not interested in doing the movie anymore due to the ongoing discussions with Marvel. He ended up leaving the project, which would mean that Sony Pictures was still slated to distribute the movie. The movie would pretty much be at a standstill till 2006, where Mark Protosevich was actually a fan of the comic book Thor, and he was asked and agreed to write the script. At this point, Sony had no interest in hanging on to the movie, so it moved over to Paramount Pictures. And this just so happens to be a perfect timing of events because that is the same year that they announced the formation of Marvel Studios, and Thor was one of the characters highlighted, with Paramount distributing a few of their movies. Everything would go silent again and fans started to worry until December of 2007, where Mark actually gave an update on it. He said, "To be like a superhero origin story, but not one about a human gaining superpowers, but of a god realizing his true potential." After drafts of these scripts were complete and a few directors got to look at them, the initial job was actually offered to Matthew Vaughn in August of 2007. He took on the gig, but there was still a lot of work to do. Seeing that the script was way bigger than the money could afford, as to Marvel only had $525 million to work with for about 4 or 5 films, Matthew Vaughn would actually go on to rewrite the script to bring it down to the required budget of $150 million. The idea was for the film to start shooting in late 2008, except one problem. The original script was $300 million to produce, so there was a slight delay in production due to the fact that they actually had to scale back so much. But now, with the major success of Iron Man, Marvel Studios actually announced that Thor would be coming out on June 2nd, 2010, with Iron Man 2 actually being used to introduce the character of Thor. At this stage in the film, not everything was going as smooth as expected. Matthew Vaughn was actually released due to the holdings on his contract, which expired in May of 2008. Marvel immediately began to look for a new director. Enter Guillermo del Toro. And I kind of find it ironic that my number 1 and 2 favorite directors of all time were both at one point attached to this movie. Now, Del Toro once again was not estranged to anything Marvel, as he previously directed Marvel's Blade 2. And up until this point, he actually directed Hellboy 1, and Hellboy 2 just came out to great critical success. Del Toro throughout his life has been cited multiple times as talking about how much he loves the classic works of Jack Kirby and how much he loved to look at the comics. So for this, he wanted to focus on the character of Loki, and he wanted to incorporate a huge amount of the original Norse mythology into the film. The initial version of Thor, which Marvel and Del Toro agreed upon, would be really dingy Valhalla. It would be Vikings and mud everywhere, almost taking on a realistic approach. Unfortunately, Guillermo del Toro ended up turning down the directing duties to go and direct The Hobbit, which he would end up waiting over 5 years to do. Throughout the summer of 2008, it was pretty much one director coming in and not getting the job, up until late September of 2008, where Kenneth Branagh entered negotiations. Branagh, having experience working on films such as Hamlet, seemed like a perfect fit, and in December of 2008 he confirmed that he was in fact hired to helm Thor. And originally he said that he was attracted to this movie because it was a human story right in the center of big epic scenarios. Now, due to so many delays and troubles with getting Thor off the ground, Branagh originally hoped that he could start filming in January of 2010, which means that Marvel would have to move back to July 16th, 2010 release date, and they moved it to June 17th of 2011, a full year later. The film would inevitably get one more move, which would see it moving to May 20th of 2011, so it wouldn't interfere with their other production, which was Captain America: The First Avenger. Now, with the director and a script set, it was time to find the leading man. Various people tried, and the first offer was made to Daniel Craig, aka James Bond. He turned it down due to obligations on the Bond franchise. The next major addition would happen in February of 2009, where Samuel L. Jackson, who is of course briefly played Nick Fury at the end of Iron Man, signed on to reprise his role as Nick Fury in Thor, and this was of course part of the 9-picture deal he had just signed with Marvel Studios to make numerous appearances. Later on, he was interviewed and retracted that, saying he was not actually a part of the movie. This was in fact supposed to be some sort of connective tissue scene that would bridge everything together, and that he was only listed as part of that due to a cameo. This would of course go on to become the post-credit scene, which included Dr. Salvik, the Tesseract, and Nick Fury. And this was the direct lead-in to the Avengers. A little bit of time would go on, and in May of 2009, we heard the rumors that Chris Hemsworth was in negotiations to star in the movie as Thor. Early on in this process, he was actually passed on multiple times along with his brother Liam Hemsworth. At this time, the only big role Chris Hemsworth was known as was playing James Tiberius Kirk's father in Star Trek in 2009. Another person who was also in the running to audition for the role of Thor was Tom Hiddleston. He did not end up getting the role of playing Thor, but he did end up playing his brother Loki. Tom Hiddleston was offered the job of Loki the next day, and he was officially the first one to be signed on. A few months would go by, and later it was confirmed by Marvel Studios head Kevin Feige that Chris Hemsworth was in fact cast as the God of Thunder, Thor. During this same time, Kevin Feige would go on to confirm that the movie would have two settings, one a modern-day Earth setting, and the alternate would be of course the setting on Asgard. And another thing was also confirmed, that Thor's alter ego, Dr. Donald Blake, would not be used, and that he would not be making his appearance in any Iron Man movies as was originally intended. And in late July of 2009, it was officially revealed that Natalie Portman would be playing Jane Foster. She was of course previously known for her roles in the Star Wars prequels. And in another interview, Stellan Skarsgård would reveal that he has been cast in Thor. He did not reveal who he was going to be, but of course we would later find out that he was going to be Dr. Salvik, who would go on and have a reoccurring role in some of the Marvel movies. As the movie was gearing up to start production, a final addition was made in the form of Idris Elba taking on the role of Heimdall. Now, this was the first time Marvel would make a major race change to a familiar character from the comics, and this was definitely not taken lightly by people online, and it sparked many debates and outrages by fans of the character. With one day before filming started, Thor would have another setback. With the turmoil that was happening with Spider-Man 4, Marvel Entertainment decided to push the release date of Thor by 2 weeks to May 6th of 2011. Shortening the amount of time they would have to finish the movie by 3 weeks. Now, of course, as part of the exclusive deal that Marvel signed, they would have to shoot in Manhattan Beach, California. And in another cost-cutting measure, they would move production to Santa Fe, New Mexico. Just a few days after the camera started rolling, it was officially reported that Clark Gregg had officially signed on to reprise his role as Agent Coulson from Iron Man 1 and 2 for Thor. and in March of 2010, production would move to New Mexico, where there was an old-fashioned based western town which they would outfit to look like a more modern town to be able to do some of the shooting. The film would end principal photography on May 6th of 2010 and would enter the post-production phase. Once here, two companies were hired to do the visual effects for the movie, Digital Domain and BUF. BUF was specifically chosen to be able to recreate some of the photography done by the Hubble Space Telescope and give it that real-world look they were striving for in the MCU, yet also make it a unique thing that no one has seen before. Digital Domain was specifically used for the creation of Jotunheim. The visual effects companies also cited that the Bifrost would be a difficult task because they had no idea what they were trying to create and what the director was trying to convey before he could really sit down and explain it to them. Once everything was set in stone, the decision was made to release the film in 3D. After Avatar made this a huge success, pretty much everybody wanted their movies in 3D to also bring in more money for higher ticket prices. Kenneth Branagh originally said that the idea of making a movie in 3D made him cringe, but when he really thought about it, he figured that this could be another element to separate the movie and the fantastical element to something that the crowd has not seen before. The only problem being that Thor was shot in 2D, so it would have to have a post 2D conversion. And as is typical with these movies, in October 2010, a few months before release, we would get the official news that the movie was going to do some reshoots. During these reshoots, it was also important for them to go back and touch up the ice giants, which initially were not that big. They were only around 6'7". So Kenneth Branagh made sure he got an actor who was much bigger. They went back and digitally remade the frost giants much taller and more formidable. A few months would go by, and in April of 2011 it was officially confirmed by Paramount and Marvel Entertainment that the film would be getting an IMAX and IMAX 3D release. And one of the last scenes that was shot for the movie was the scene with Eric Salvik coming face to face with Nick Fury, which was directed by Joss Whedon on the set of The Avengers. The film did also have an original orchestral soundtrack. This one was done by Patrick Doyle. To this day, this is one of my favorite movie soundtracks of all time. If you have seen the movie, these tracks literally will run the entire scenes in your mind as you are listening to them. They are absolutely mesmerizing and perfect. If I had to pick one favorite track from this soundtrack, it would be the Sons of Odin theme. Now, much like all the Marvel movies up to this day, Thor was of course another movie loaded with Easter eggs. Clark Gregg once again reprised his role as Agent Coulson. And if you watch the movie right after you watch Iron Man 2, you will undoubtedly notice that this movie takes place at the same time as the third act of Iron Man 2. While his role was not as big as Black Widow's in Iron Man 2, this was our first cinematic universe debut of Jeremy Renner playing the character of Hawkeye. And another giant Easter egg that would be a hint towards the entirety of the Marvel Universe and building up to something giant was the inclusion of the Infinity Gauntlet, which of course along with that got us confirmation that Thanos does exist in this universe. And just like the two previous Iron Man movies and The Incredible Hulk, there was of course a Sega video game. Thor: God of Thunder would release a few months after the movie in September 13th of 2011. It would see releases on all the major home consoles, from the PlayStation 3 to the Xbox 360, the Wii, and the Nintendo DS. Overall, the scores were pretty much on the low spectrum of things. The PS3 and the 360 version got an average of a 2 out of 10. I myself own this game, and I can say that it is truly awful. The Wii and Nintendo 3DS versions did a little bit better, averaging 5 out of 10. Now, the marketing for this movie had to be pretty huge. This was the first movie that wasn't Iron Man, and this was a very unsure thing. The Incredible Hulk, since that was a Universal thing, was not a true Marvel Disney property. So in July of 2010, Marvel Studios would hold the Thor panel at the 2010 San Diego Comic-Con, showing exclusive images and even some short clips and trailers. Unfortunately for them, this footage quickly leaked online just about a week later. Originally, there was also supposed to be an animated Marvel series consisting of 26 episodes based on Thor. This was later cancelled and reshuffled into a direct-to-video movie, Thor: Tales of Asgard. With everything going according to plan, Marvel would release Thor on May 6th of 2011. The film would go on to become #1 that opening weekend, and in North America it went on to make $181 million. Worldwide, it would also go on to have a total of $449.3 million, which would find the film as the 15th highest grossing of 2011. The film was a huge success. On the critics side of things, it did not fare as good as Iron Man 1, but it did far better than Iron Man 2. Thor would average 82 out of 100. So with the God of Thunder an official huge success in starting his own franchise, a month before its official release, Marvel was confident enough that Kevin Feige would come out and say that post-Avengers, Thor would continue on in a solo film series. But after the release of Thor, everybody had their doubts about the next film that was about to hit for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that being Captain America: The First Avenger. But the story of Captain America and to bring him to the big screen does not begin at this point. Instead, we are going to take a trip all the way back to the late 70s, where in the wake of DC's success with Superman the movie, Marvel would try to bring Captain America to film form. This was not a big success. But nonetheless, Marvel would stick to their guns and even produce a sequel to this, in form of Captain America 2, Death Too Soon. And Death Too Soon could not be a fitting title because the franchise at this point was dead. But that was not the end of Captain America trying to get his own movie off the ground. After the monumental success and the revolution of the superhero blockbuster, which we saw in Tim Burton's Batman '89, Marvel wanted to try again. This gave us Captain America in 1990. While this film was far better than the other two, there were still many problems and unnecessary changes that were done to it. Fans definitely did not enjoy this movie, and remains one of the typical movies you can find at a local comic convention for bootleg for very cheap. To me, this movie holds a special place in my heart because when I moved to the United States in 1996, my dad took me to the video store and I rented 3 VHSs. The first one being Back to the Future 1, which would be my favorite movie of all time. The second being Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, packing the first 3 episodes of the animated series. And the third being this specific Captain America movie. This was my first exposure to Captain America and I loved the movie. Over time, I've grown to see all of its problems and I'm definitely a critic of it and I do not enjoy it as much as I did when I was younger, but it definitely has a special place in my heart. So after the movie's released, it failed to really do anything to help save Marvel from the inevitable 1990s bankruptcy. And now we jump forward to 1997, where a distribution deal was made with Artisan Entertainment and Marvel was going to actually have a brand new movie. The idea of this movie would inevitably turn out to be Captain America: The First Avenger. But there were a few problems happening at Marvel Comics at the time. At first, there was a major issue with Joe Simon over the ownership of Captain America and who exactly created the character and who owned him in his current inception. Unfortunately, something that would become commonplace with Marvel distribution and character licenses, this movie did not materialize and nothing happened with it due to various lawsuits going on till September of 2003. For a couple of years, the movie just sat there as a concept with nothing really happening, up until 2005, where Marvel Studios got the loan to be able to finance and produce a bunch of films. Of course, the releases were going to be handled by Paramount Pictures. Now we are in the year 2006, where everything seems to be taking shape. Marvel has decided that they are moving forward with a brand new universe of movies. Unknown to them is if it's still going to be all shared or disconnected from one another. At the time, both Kevin Feige and the producer of the movie Avi Arad said that the movie would be a standalone picture because it would not fit into the current mold or ideas that people see films as. And this was of course enforced by the people that gave them the money because they did not actually believe that the idea of having to see multiple movies by different characters could all culminate in a huge success. Now at this point, the script was still very early in its design. The original idea was to save on the budget, so the movie would be half of it spent in World War II and half of it spent in modern day. And it was supposed to be one of those typical man-at-a-time movies, where we look at the character today and how he's evolved a couple of years after he was unfrozen, where then we would flash back to World War II and see the man that he was. Kevin Feige also at this time said that Back to the Future trilogy was a big influence on this, to see the evolution of characters and the time periods. And in February of 2006, he even said that he had someone in mind who he wanted to star, and definitely had a director in his mind, but he was not ready to talk about that yet. Later on in the spring of 2006, producer Avi Arad announced that they planned a summer 2008 release date. This was supposed to be the original release date of Iron Man 1. A few directors decided to approach Marvel to try to get the gig, one famous one being Jon Favreau, who approached them saying he wanted to make a pure comedy movie based in World War II. His ideas were rejected and he was instead offered Iron Man. A little more time would go by, and in April of 2006, David Self was hired to write the official first draft. During his initial interviews and getting to talk about why Captain America, he said because as a child this was his favorite superhero. His dad would constantly tell him that he could one day become Captain America if he chose to do the right thing. And that same month we would hear the first rumors that Joe Johnston has officially met with Marvel to direct the film. And right around the time everything was shaping up to actually meet their 2008 release date, everything went south really quickly. The film went on full hold during the 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike, which did not only impact this movie but was felt all throughout Hollywood in TV and films. Marvel, seeing this as a problem, tried to resolve everything quickly, and in January of 2008, everything was back to normal. The writers were back on working on Captain America. Unfortunately, the few months they had to take off from it would inevitably hurt the film. Fast forward to May 5th, 2008, after the huge initial success and the release of Iron Man in the United States, Marvel was right now at the height of their confidence and announced that Captain America, the First Avenger, which was at the time the working title, would officially release on May 6th of 2011. The movie was later pushed back to July 22nd. To make room for Thor. Now at this time, a few more directors would meet with Marvel once again. Jon Favreau offered his services but was ultimately turned down to be able to do Iron Man 2. Louis Leterrier, after his success on The Incredible Hulk, had meetings with Marvel but inevitably ended up not getting the job. And another giant span of time would go by until November of 2008, where officially Joe Johnston was hired to direct the movie. After being hired, Johnston was quick to hire a few of his friends, Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely. Both joined the project to be able to do rewrites. Kevin Feige then would go on to say that the decision to add Joe Johnston was due to his directing ability on October Sky and The Rocketeer. And he also cited that his special effects work with the original Star Wars trilogy was very important, and that one of the big influences for the movie would be the look and feel of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Now at the time that this movie was being produced, there was a lot of trouble with positioning Captain America as the face of Marvel. The United States at the time was trying to recover from various financial troubles and was still fighting a battle with a war that many of its allies disagreed with. And many worried that putting Captain America in the title of a movie would spell its imminent doom across the pond. At the time, many rumors on websites were reporting that the title of the movie was actually going to be changed to The First Avenger, and that Captain America would entirely be removed from the title. In an interview, when asked about how the anti-US perception of America is perceived and if they are worried about that, Kevin Feige said, "Marvel is perceived pretty well around the world right now, and I think putting another uber Marvel hero into worldwide box office would be a good thing." After that quote came out, producer of the movie Avi Arad also added, "Captain America stands for freedom, for all democracies, for hope all around the world. He was created to stop tyranny, and the idea of stopping tyrants is important today as it was then. So I think we will have some interesting challenges, but at the end of the day, if the movie is terrific and the movie talks to the world, it's not about one place, it's about the world, and I think on that basis it will be very successful." Later on, after the election of President Obama as the next US president, Kevin Feige would say, "The idea of change and hope has permeated the country, regardless of policies, and that includes Hollywood." Fast forward to December of 2009, where Joe Johnston was being interviewed, and he said the filming of the film would start in April of 2010, a little over a year from release date, which Marvel has been known to do. And he said that at the time, pretty much everybody that was in the pre-production stage right now in Manhattan Beach, California, were just sitting around trying to come up with the coolest concepts that they could do. And of course, with conceptual art, money and budget is not a problem yet. So once they got it, they could pick and choose what they wanted to keep and what they wanted to use later on. During another interview a few weeks later, he would give us an idea of what the movie was going to be about. He said, and I quote, "The film will begin in 1942. 1943, during World War II. The stuff from the 60s and 70s comic books we're sort of avoiding. We're going back to the 40s, and then follow to what they were doing in Captain America Now." And in February of 2010, during one of his big interviews, Joe Johnston stated that the invaders would appear in the film and would be featured in the entire second half of the movie. Now, of course, this would have to be a much different composition of the team, such as Namor the Submariner, who was at the time at Universal Studios. He would then start doing what most Marvel directors would become famous for doing, going back on their words and trying to say that he was misquoted. He added that there would definitely be a team of people that work with Captain America, but whether their name was the Invaders was up to debate. And then it was added on by one of the writers that the team was currently known as the Howling Commandos. Joe Johnston would then go on to say the design of the whole movie was to create technology that could be built in the 1940s, although they had to go fantastical with it since the addition and the use of the cube technology being integrated with it. And since Hitler throughout history famously has been known to dabble into the occult, and his fascination with advanced technology and aliens, this provided quick connective tissue to be able to link it up with Thor. But not only that, these prototype vehicles and projects by the Nazis that were never used were a direct inspiration to the vehicles that we see in the first Avenger. And later on, the vehicle designer for Tron Legacy was appointed the lead designer in all the vehicles in the movie. Johnston then went on and said he chose Daniel Simon due to his book Cosmic Motors. And he said that he was very influential into his reason for getting into the industry, and specifically many of his designs for Star Wars. A great example of this was when Joe Johnston said that the Red Skull Scar was based on two different Mercedes-Benz vehicles from the 1930s, the 540K and the G4. Now, ever since the original announcement that Captain America would become a feature film, many names throughout Hollywood were rumored or even auditioned for the role. Famously, one of Hollywood's big action star pushes at the time, Sam Worthington, was actually in talks. Along with that, we also heard and got confirmation that Will Smith was actually in negotiations. Just a couple of days before we would get the official casting, we actually had a list that leaked out of all of the shortlist actors potentially up to be offered the contract in the next couple of days. A few of the notable names on that list were Sebastian Stan, Jason Eccles, Channing Tatum, and Chris Evans. At the same time, we learned that there was also casting going on for Agent Carter. Allison Eve, Keira Knightley, and Emily Blunt were all considered. Blunt ultimately chose to decline the role, which would then go on to be played by Hayley Atwell. And in March of 2010, it was officially announced that the former Human Torch, Chris Evans, was cast as Captain America, and that Agent Smith from The Matrix, Hugo Weaving, would be playing the Red Skull. Now, at the time, Captain America, by this point being my favorite superhero, I was absolutely outraged that Human Torch was going to be playing this character. Having seen two horrible Fantastic Four movies, which the Fantastic Four are my favorite team in comic books, I was absolutely enraged with this casting. And boy, am I glad to have been so wrong, because Chris Evans would become to define what Captain America is. Later on, Sebastian Stan, who was of course in the running to play Captain America, would become the Winter Soldier, aka Bucky Barnes. Now, this would go on to be a common thing with Marvel and their Disney movies, where the second and third choice would inevitably come back down the road in another movie for another role or something very close to what they were originally considered for. Just a few days after that, it was officially announced that the title has been changed. Formerly known as the First Avenger, Captain America, due to the markets, Marvel was going to stick to their guns and call the movie Captain America: The First Avenger. And the day right after that was announced, Marvel Studios officially announced that Joss Whedon, who has recently been hired to direct Marvel's The Avengers, would see some of the rewrites for the movie as part of his agreement to work with Marvel. Later on in August that year, when he was asked how much of an exact input he had on the script, Joss Whedon would go on to say he just had minor character connections that he was working with. Joss Whedon said also that there was originally a very tight script that they were working with, so he went in there and he wanted to explore some of the relationship between the characters just a little bit more and insert a little bit more heart. Even if that made the movie slow, they knew it would pay off in the future. And that same month, Samuel L. Jackson would go on to reveal that he would be reprising his role as Nick Fury as part of his 9-movie contract. And in May of that year, there was confirmation that Toby Jones has entered final negotiations to play the famous villain Arnim Zola. And in that same article, it was announced by Jon Favreau, the director of Iron Man 1 and 2, that a younger version of Howard Stark would be appearing in the film, being of course played by Dominic Cooper. Over the next couple of months, we would get many more castings. Neil McDonough was officially cast as Dum-Dum Dugan. Now, when getting to talk about his contract, he said that he signed multiple contracts that were not necessarily just prominent for the movies. He said it might even be for television shows. On an interesting side note, a couple of years later, he would go on to become the villain of Arrow and also appear in Legends of Tomorrow. He, of course, goes on and plays the character of Damien Darhk. And the final major casting that would happen was Stanley Tucci as of course the creator of the Super Soldier Serum. Production on the film officially began on June 28th of 2010. On that same day, Marvel confirmed that Tommy Lee Jones was officially cast for the movie, and the fact that the rumors about Dominic Cooper playing a younger version of Howard Stark, whose character previously appeared in Iron Man 2, were also true. Along with this also came the announcement that the film would shoot in London that July, and that they had intentions to keep a bunch of the key locations from London. Now obviously, this being a film set during World War II, they needed to shoot a whole lot of war scenes. This lasted throughout the majority of September of 2010. And a big part of Liverpool was actually used to double for the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Other scenes that were shot in Liverpool of course included the inclusion of the Stark Expo. At this time, Joe Johnston decided to toss a huge Easter egg in there as part of the original rumors that the invaders were going to appear. And this is where we witnessed the Human Torch, the original android, appear in the movie. And at the same day that they announced that Thor would be getting a 3D release, Marvel also announced that Captain America: The First Avenger would also be getting a 3D theatrical release. Joe Johnston says that he had one day to actually shoot with a 3D camera and he found it a nightmare, so he opted to shoot the movie in 2D with a post 3D conversion, as he found the giant clunky cameras to get in the way of the action sequences. He said, and I quote, "It was a nightmare." But instead of doing a cheap 2D to 3D conversion like most studios at the time were doing, Johnston opted to actually extend the post-production time of the movie, going in and retouching up every scene to make sure that the 3D was not flat. By November of 2010, word has got out that the filming of Captain America: The First Avenger was officially over. And in February of 2011, it was officially announced that Alan Silvestri would officially be composing the film's score. And in March of 2011, it was officially announced that Captain America: The First Avenger would be undergoing reshoots in the United Kingdom and around Los Angeles. And there was also a one-day shoot added to New York City in Times Square on April 23rd, 2011. In the post-production of the movie, it was revealed that the film has nearly 1,600 visual effects that were all divvied up between 3 production companies. One major contributor to this was an LA company called LOLA, who specialized in quote-unquote plastic digital surgery. And this was the main company and technique that they used to be able to take Chris Evans and make him look tiny. For the process of this, they also used a body double to be able to simulate what it would look like. They cited this as a long process, but in the end, it was all worth it. Now, one of the most important aspects of Captain America and one of the most recognizable was of course his iconic shield. 4 different types of shields were used. One made out of metal, fiberglass, rubber, and computer-generated graphics. The one specifically that was used in all the close-ups was the aluminum shield, and that was known as the Hero Shield / the Beauty Shield. Chris Evans would usually use one of the lighter ones for the movie, and of course then they would go over it in post-production with CG to add that metallic look. And speaking of post-production and heavy uses of CG, Hugo Weaving wore a mask for his portrayal of the Red Skull. The mask on set was very bulky and you could see that it was a clear prosthetic. There was an entire visual effects team just focusing on the Red Skull's mask, including manipulating it to have a more bony structure. They would thin out the cheek, remove some of the eye depth, make them more hollow, and of course manipulate the lips, while also making sure that the skin on the Red Skull was very tight. The original soundtrack, as mentioned before, was composed by Alan Silvestri, and they definitely went out of their way to make sure that it had the feel of a 1940s marching band and that it reflected Captain America's nature. The soundtrack did also include the Star-Spangled Man, which many in the industry felt that it should have been nominated for some sort of award. Unfortunately, this being a comic book movie, it got overlooked. And as with all the previous Marvel Cinematic Universe versions, we of course got a video game based around the movie. This time it was Captain America Super Soldier, which was published by Sega. The game would release on July 15th, 2011 on the Nintendo DS, the PlayStation 3, the Wii, and the Xbox 360. Out of all the Marvel video games based on the movies, this is definitely the best one, as the critics reflected this also. The game has averaged a 7 out of 10. And it does not even really stick to the movie or anything like that. Instead, it goes off and does its own thing for a majority of it. It is a third-person action-adventure game. You definitely spend a lot of time feeling like you are Captain America. And if you are interested in playing any of the MCU-based video games, this is the one I would highly recommend. The film would go on to have its premiere on July 11th of 2011, with the film being screened at San Diego Comic-Con on July 21st of 2011, with a final worldwide release happening in the United States and Canada on July 22nd, 2011. The film would of course go on to become #1 at the box office, opening with $65.1 million, only $0.5 million behind the previous opening of Thor. By the end of its box office run, the movie managed to make $370.6 million on a budget of $140 million. While by today's standards this would be looked at as a failure, Marvel saw this as a victory, considering their ultimate plan was to lead up to the Avengers. And now having the backing of Disney Entertainment and the entire Disney marketing machine, the outlook for the future was bright. And as was customary with Marvel movies at this point, everybody knew to stay after the credits. The people that stayed were treated to a very brief post-credit scene of Captain America in the gym working out and Nick Fury walking up to him and asking him to recruit him. The words "Captain America will return in the Avengers" showed up on the screen, followed by the teaser trailer to the Avengers, which lasted about 45 seconds. Between Iron Man, the Incredible Hulk, Thor, and Captain America, the Marvel future looked brighter than ever. But now everybody had their eyes set on the ultimate risk in Hollywood's history. Can Marvel find a director and someone who can put the Avengers on the screen and deliver the goods that so many are afraid of? So join me next episode as we look at the impact and the cultural change and the change to Hollywood that the Avengers would cause. From the release of Iron Man in 2008 to the release of the Avengers in 2012, it was only a mere 4 years to realize a dream that a few people held so close to their heart. And this was going to be the movie that either made the Marvel Cinematic Universe a huge success or a complete failure. But the story of the Avengers does not begin in 2012. Instead, it takes us all the way back to the formation of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Before there was Iron Man, the Incredible Hulk, Thor, and Captain America, there was Avi Arad. And in early April of 2005, Avi Arad, the CEO of Marvel Studios, would officially announce his plans to develop an Avengers feature film. This announcement was of course accompanied with the huge news that Marvel Entertainment has officially declared independence of Merrill Lynch, which was their previous partner, and this was to produce the slate of films that would be distributed by Paramount Pictures. Later on, speaking to the Wall Street analysts, Marvel Studios intended to originally release all the individual characters in their own standalone movies. There was of course various reasons that Marvel intended to do it this way, but their main argument was the fact that these characters were still relatively new in the minds of the everyday population. So if they could introduce every character one by one in their own films, and have them get together in a full feature film down the road, the audience would be more likely to go see the rest of the films to know what exactly is happening. While the plans from 2005 on were rolling for every individual character to get their own movie off the ground, Marvel was not in a rush to produce the Avengers just yet, until February of 2007, where Warner Brothers announced that they were officially going to be making a Justice League movie titled Justice League Mortal, which would go on to be directed by George Miller. Warner Brothers worried about the success of the Justice League and the people not knowing who all of these characters are, and worrying about bad critical reception due to all these characters being thrown together at the last moment and not having an established universe, decided to pull the plug on Justice League Mortal the day they started shooting. And just a few months after the announcement of Justice League Mortal, Marvel announced that screenwriter Zach Penn, who originally wrote The Incredible Hulk, was hired to write the film. But unfortunately, it was not going to be smooth sailing from there. Due to the 2007-2008 writer strike, which delayed a whole lot of production in Hollywood, the movie would see minor setbacks and delays in writing. But Marvel would find themselves ahead of most. Marvel would be quick to go to negotiations with the Writers Guild of America, and Marvel was successful, guaranteeing that they could make films based on Captain America, Ant-Man, and the Avengers. And after the huge success of the 2008 release of Iron Man, Marvel Studios would go on to set a July 2011 release date for the Avengers. And in September of 2008, that very same year, Marvel Studios would announce a brand new partnership on top of the one they already had with Paramount Pictures, which would give the company the distribution rights to 5 future films. Casting for the first Avengers movie began in October of 2008. With the first person agreeing to reprise his role being Robert Downey Jr., who is of course Iron Man. By that time, it was already public knowledge that Terrence Howard has been replaced by Don Cheadle to play James Rhodes, aka War Machine. It was reported by multiple outlets that he would be reprising his role in the Avengers. Later on, Don Cheadle would say that he does not think that the War Machine character will be appearing in the movie. And by the time that news hit, no one could focus on the recasting because 2 other major pieces of news would help Marvel cement itself in a bright future. The first being that the director of Iron Man 1, Jon Favreau, has signed on to be the executive producer of the Avengers, and the second piece of news being that there has been a deal made to produce 3 additional movies, this being Iron Man 2, Thor, and Captain America: The First Avenger. Just a few days later, it would be confirmed by Lou Ferrigno, who of course voiced the Hulk, that he would have a role in the upcoming Avengers movie. And in February of 2009, Samuel L. Jackson would officially announce that he has signed a 9-picture movie deal with Marvel Studios that would include film and TV appearances. And also in September of 2009, Edward Norton, who of course previously played Bruce Banner in The Incredible Hulk, said he was open to negotiations to reprise his role. Later on in October of 2009, Jon Favreau, the executive producer of Avengers, would officially come out and say that he is not going to be the director. And when asked about it, he had this to say: "It's going to be hard, because I was so involved in creating the world of Iron Man, and Iron Man is very much a tech-based hero. And then with the Avengers, You're going to be introducing some superhero aspects because of Thor. Mixing the two of those works very well in the comic books, but it's going to take a lot of thoughtfulness to make that work. And while the casting of Black Widow for Iron Man 2 was on the way, various people reported that Emily Blunt, who was currently in the negotiations for the role of the Black Widow for Iron Man 2, would be reprising her role. But in March of 2009, we would get the official news that Scarlett Johansson was in fact going to play the Black Widow and also be reprising her role in future Marvel films. And we now also know that in the early drafts of the film that Hank Pym and the Wasp were originally to be included. Ant-Man being pulled out of the movie due to Edgar Wright's involvement with the standalone Ant-Man film, and the Wasp being pulled at last minute due to her taking a huge forefront in the film due to the director's preference. And just a few weeks later, it was officially announced that Marvel would be delaying the film from its initial July 2011 release date to May 4th of 2012, almost a full year later. But at the same time, they announced that Chris Hemsworth would be reprising his role as Thor, and Tom Hiddleston would be back as Loki. And right after that announcement, Zach Penn in 2009 would go on to say that his role and job was to go between all of the movies and make sure that everything was lining up accordingly. They wanted the movies to feel like a comic book, to feel interconnected, and for the audience to be rewarded if they saw all the movies and knew what was happening as an overall story and what everything was building towards. Next up in 2010 would be the next official big thing we get about the Avengers, with the media getting to do a sit-down interview with Kevin Feige. And while asking him questions about Iron Man 2, they got to ask specifically about the Avengers and the involvement of such characters as Thor. And one of the many things most of the outlets were interested in was how Marvel was going to be able to balance the fantastical and supernatural world of Thor to the semi-realistic version of Iron Man that is featured in the world. At this point, he would go on to talk about the trio life and the old Norse mythologies, saying that this is like real science, but it's science that we haven't discovered yet. This would actually go on to be almost identically described in the Thor movie. And right after this, it was officially confirmed that Zach Penn had completed the first draft of the Avengers, which was given to Joe Quesada, Marvel's editor-in-chief, along with Brian Michael Bendis. And on that same day, it was confirmed that Chris Evans would be playing Captain America in 3 feature films, one of these being the upcoming Avengers. And after the announcement of Chris Evans, in April of 2010, the rumors hit the internet with a confirmation by the man himself, Joss Whedon, that he was close to final negotiations to direct the upcoming film. At the same time, Louis Leterrier, the director of The Incredible Hulk, also offered his services to Marvel, but was ultimately turned down. And Joss Whedon was hired officially in July of 2010. And when Whedon officially signed on, he took the original draft by Zach Penn and told Marvel that they had nothing here. He said, and I quote, "Pretend this draft never happened." Right after that, Whedon would go on to write a quick 5-page treatment for his own vision of the Avengers film. The tagline for this was Avengers, Some Assembly Required, which was an obvious riff and a nod to Avengers Assemble. Marvel quickly agreed to let Joss Whedon direct and write the Avengers movie, although they did put a few stipulations in there. For starters, the villain of the movie would need to be Loki. The second act of the movie would have to focus on the team fighting amongst each other. And of course, their main requirement, the movie must be done by May of 2012. Upon Joss Whedon being hired, Avi Arad had a few things to say. He said, and I quote, "My personal opinion is that Joss will do a fantastic job. He loves these characters and is a fantastic writer. It's part of his life, so you know he's going to protect it. I expect someone like him to go and make the script even better." And at this time, Joss Whedon was no stranger to the Marvel Universe, previously having actually written Marvel comics based on the X-Men. Kevin Feige would also go on and add, "I've known Joss for many years. We were looking for the right thing and he came in and met on it. We wanted to find a director on the verge of doing something great, and we think Joss is it. And later on at San Diego Comic-Con 2010, Joss Whedon in an interview said what drew him to these characters was the fact that none of them should be together, none of them should be a family or getting along, but they are forced to work on the same team. The rest of 2010 would mainly be focused on casting of additional roles. Jeremy Renner of course reprised his role as Hawkeye from Thor, Clark Gregg was once again back as Agent Coulson, and we got the official announcement that Mark Ruffalo would be replacing Edward Norton. Now, to this date, we still do not know the full story of why Edward Norton was replaced, as both sides have their own version. Originally, Edward Norton felt like he got disrespected by Marvel and Universal on the development of The Incredible Hulk, when they told him that they would use all of the material and character development that was in the movie that he had specifically written for it, and then editing out close to 30 minutes of it left him in a bad position. He decided not to do any of the marketing for that movie. On the other hand, Edward Norton claims that they always wanted to go with Mark Ruffalo, as he was Universal's number 2 choice, which Marvel was pushing for number 1, but he did not end up getting it, as Universal thought that they needed a bigger star for the Hulk. Kevin Feige would go on to add a quote that says, "Our decision is definitely not one based on monetary factors, but instead rooted in the need for an actor who embodies the creative and collaborative spirit of our other talented cast members." Quickly after that statement was given, Edward Norton's agent would go on and say that that statement was purposefully misleading and an inappropriate attempt to paint our client in a negative light. Later on in 2014, Edward Norton would come out and say that it was officially his decision to pass up on playing the Hulk, that he did not want to be associated with just playing one character. And after all of that, in August of 2010, it was reported by Paramount Pictures and Marvel Studios that they officially plan to start shooting in February of 2011. Simultaneously, they announced that they would also be shooting the entire movie in 3D. And just 2 months after that, in October of 2010, Grumman Studios in New York and Steiner Studios in Brooklyn were announced as the official filming locations. And later on that month, Walt Disney Studios, who is of course the owner of Marvel, agreed to pay Paramount at least $115 million for the worldwide distribution rights to Iron Man 3 and the Avengers. In turn, this deal would allow Paramount to have their logo show up in associations with the Marvel Studios at the beginning of all of their movies. And the final amount of casting was completed in February of 2011, where Kobe Smulders was officially cast as Maria Hill. Stellan Skarsgård of course reprised his role from Thor, and both Paul Bettany and Gwyneth Paltrow reprised their roles from the Iron Man films. Principal photography for the movie started on April 25th of 2011 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And just 2 short months later, in June of 2011, the stuntman Jeremy Fitzgerald was badly injured trying to do a stunt which involved a 30-foot drop. But despite the injury, he would quickly recover and continue to be working on the set of the movie. Once production in New Mexico was over, it moved over to Ohio in August of 2011. 4 weeks would be spent on location shooting on the East 9th Street of Ohio, which would double for New York's 42nd Street. This is of course where the majority of the final battle in the third act of the movie would take place. And reserve soldiers which were assigned to the Columbus, Ohio base, who were part of the Ohio-based 391st Military Police Battalion, provided background characters and action during those pivotal scenes. And the staff sergeant of this base was very pleased with the outcome of how the military was portrayed in the movie. And speaking of Ohio, that was not the only thing that was shot there. They also shot various scenes in the large vacuum chamber at NASA, which is right near Sandusky, Ohio. These scenes would be used for the opening of the movie, which of course saw Loki and the testing on the Tesseract. And additional scenes were shot around Ohio, specifically near the Detroit Superior Bridge, and the public square in the southwest quadrant, which was turned into Germany at the beginning of the movie. And the final stage of filming would see the principal photography move to New York City, where they only shot about 2 days worth. The 2 main locations which were used for shooting were Park Avenue and Central Park. But for the rest of the scenes that take place in Manhattan and around New York, they decided to take a more CG approach. So for 3 days, the actual effects supervisor Jake Morrison was on location to get various reference and aerial shots of the surrounding areas of New York. Morrison explained that this was the best way to get opening shots and wide shots of New York, while stating that CG can recreate the same thing, you just do not get the actual feel of New York as if you were actually to look at a real shot. After shooting was wrapped, it was quickly announced in December of 2011 that the film would be converted to 3D. And Joss Whedon went on and said that he did not have a problem with this, as the way his movies are shot would make sense for it, and he said that the Avengers would not be obnoxiously 3D, there wouldn't be things to just fly at your face for no reason. And just a month after that, in January of 2012, it was reported by Disney that the film would be digitally remastered for an IMAX 3D experience, and that the film would see an IMAX release day and date with the worldwide release. And in May of 2012, Joss Whedon officially announced that he decided to include Thanos in the post-credits scene of the Avengers. Although the character was not identified as Thanos, Joss Whedon definitely said that this is who it was intended to be. He said that he is the most powerful and fascinating Marvel villain. He is the granddaddy of badasses, and that's why he loves him. And he said that one of the many reasons doing this was because when you look at some of the most important things that have happened in Marvel, Thanos was behind all of them. So it was a great way to have Loki working for someone while building up a future villain. And then of course there is the scene of the Avengers eating shawarma, which was shot just one day after the worldwide premiere of the movie on April 12th of 2012. And many people thought that this scene came out of nowhere, but this was actually a callback to Joss Whedon's previous work on Angel and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And that the scene of them just kind of sitting around and eating shawarma was almost an identical scene of what happened after they finished a long shoot during an episode of Buffy. They were just worn out and stuffing food into their mouth. Now when it came down to finishing all the visual effects shots for the movie, over 2,200 visual effects shots in total were combined to deliver the final product. 14 companies collaborated on this movie, including big notes such as Industrial Light and Magic, Weta Digital, and Digital Domain, just to name a few. Now of course the leading visual effects were all done by Industrial Light and Magic, or ILM for short, and they were the leaders on creating some of the most important scenes in the Avengers, including the cityscape and the digital sky you see around the entire city. Another thing they had a major factor in was of course the design and the use of the helicarrier, and most importantly the body doubles for Iron Man and the Hulk. And of course the technology having advanced since the last time they used the Hulk in the Incredible Hulk, Mark Ruffalo would be used for all references for the Hulk wearing a motion capture suit. But at the same time he was wearing the suit, they were actually motion tracking his face as well, because they wanted to convey the entire emotion range from Mark Ruffalo to the Hulk. Now to recreate New York as faithfully as they could, Industrial Light and Magic sent an entire team of photographers to New York City for 8 weeks. The team was assigned by collecting as much high detail photography as they could to be able to recreate 10 city blocks of New York City for correct reference. The shots were sent back every day to Industrial Light and Magic, which would then convert them to a digital New York playground. During these 8 weeks, Sony and Avi Arad had conversations with Marvel Studios, and the two agreed upon themselves that they would let Oscorp Tower, which was featured in The Amazing Spider-Man, feature in their movie. Unfortunately, it was too late due to Industrial Light and Magic already being almost wrapped on getting New York City to look how it does in real life, and the Avengers Tower was instead the only one they could get in there, so Oscorp Tower had to be pulled. Now as with any big Hollywood movie, of course they are going to need an accompanying soundtrack. Alan Silvestri was hired after his phenomenal work on Captain America: The First Avenger. And many of the same soundtrack cues and elements that could be heard in the first Avenger transition over to the Avengers soundtrack. And in March of 2012, the rock band Soundgarden announced on their Facebook page that their song Live to Rise would be included in the film's soundtrack. As the days counted down towards the release in February of 2012, Disney officially announced that the film would get retitled in European regions. Not to be confused with the British TV series of the same name, the film would be retitled Avengers Assemble. And other areas would do the same thing, except they would be called Marvel's Avengers Assemble. which that phrase was also a big marketing thing as it started to appear on all their action figures and various other Marvel products. This started as early as 2010 as Marvel and Disney saw that making Avengers Assemble the phrase a marketing slogan would be beneficial to getting the brand awareness out there. Now, unlike promotions for their other movies, which did have a pretty big presence at Comic-Cons, the Avengers would see such promotion that was unmatched by almost any other movie by Marvel or Disney up until this point. Having skipped out showing anything for San Diego Comic-Con of 2011, it was announced by Marvel Studios that October 2011 at New York Comic-Con would be a big reveal for the Avengers. This also happens to be the first time I went to any comic convention and I was actually sitting in person when they revealed the first footage, and the room absolutely exploded in claps. If you actually watch the replay of that, which can still be found on YouTube, you can distinctly hear me screaming F yeah when they announced Mark Ruffalo was there. And of course, keeping all of their cards close to their chest, the next time we would see a major reveal of anything for the Avengers would be at the following Super Bowl of the same year of release, where a quick 30-second spot was shown telling people that they could find the full trailer online. The trailer in just 24 hours will go on to be the biggest trailer of all time, surpassing The Dark Knight Rises by 12 million views. And much like all the previous films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, The Avengers was set to have a video game release concurrent with the release date of the feature film. The game was set to release on the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, the Wii U, and the PC, and it was going to be a first-person shooter / brawler. Now, unlike the previous releases, this game was not going to be put out by Sega. Instead, it was actually being developed by THQ and THQ Studios Australia. But unfortunately, due to THQ going bankrupt and having to shut off all of their studios, the game was inevitably cancelled. Only one surviving version of the game exists, and it is at the hands of Joe Quesada, who is of course the president of Marvel Comics. But the story of this game did not actually mirror what was happening in the movie, where the movie was actually an invasion done by the Chitauri, which were led by Loki and pushed by Thanos. The game was actually going to focus on a comic book storyline involving the Skrulls. So after the failure of THQ, Ubisoft saw it quick to snatch up the Avengers license and would put out a video game of their own. This will be a motion capture game titled Marvel Avengers Battle for Earth. The game was developed for the Xbox 360 and the Wii U, specifically to use motion controls. The game got an overall score of a 6 out of 10, being just good enough, but many people criticized it for just being lackluster and having no real heart. And then came the big day, the worldwide release of The Avengers, which of course was tracking for a $150 million opening weekend in the United States. All eyes were now on Disney. Was this going to be a huge success that finally paid off the ultimate gamble, or was this going to be the ultimate failure where everybody would say, "I told you so"? And after the weekend was over, Marvel's Avengers managed to be the first movie to pass $200 million opening dollar weekend with a total of $207.5 million. The film managed to shatter every expectation anybody had going into it. But that was not the only record it would shatter. The second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh weekend, it held records on all of those. Fastest to break 1 billion and various other records were all shattered by this movie. The film would go on to make $1.52 billion in its entire theatrical run, ending its run as the third highest grossing movie of all time. And to this day, it is still the highest grossing comic book movie of all time. And what is even more impressive is the fact that it is the third highest graded comic book movie of all time on Rotten Tomatoes, only sitting second to the tie between The Dark Knight and Iron Man 1. And after a huge success in theaters, it was no wonder that the movie was going to be coming out faster than most Disney releases on home media, which would see its release on September 25th, 2012 on DVD, digital, and Blu-ray. And Marvel and Disney also teamed up to bring us a special edition Phase 1 box set, which would take all of the previous movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe and pack them all into one box for the ultimate collector. The film would go on to hold the #1 spot for home release for close to 5 weeks. When it came to the lasting impact of the movie, the film would go on to win over 22 awards, whether it was the best film, best visuals, best villain, or whatever else you could throw it into. But the biggest award that the Avengers won was the approval of fans, as now Marvel has become the #1 brand in the world, surpassing that of Batman, Superman, and Spider-Man. Avengers Assemble, that line was now a worldwide trademark and a worldwide recognition of success. And soon after this, Hollywood would see a boom of studios trying to copy this success in trying to create a shared universe. But Marvel had the opposite idea. Now that we've tackled the big screen, let's tackle the small screen. And they would start the production on their first Marvel television series titled Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. So after the Walt Disney purchase of Marvel Entertainment in 2009, one of the first big pieces of announcement was the fact that Marvel announced the Marvel Television division was being formed under the leadership of Jeff Loeb. And in the months following that announcement, various different pilots went into production. And in July of 2012, right on the heels of the Avengers' huge success, ABC and Marvel Television announced a partnership to bring a MCU-style series to television next fall. At the time, it was unknown what the series would be about, but Marvel did say a kernel of an idea with a number of scenarios being explored, including a high-concept cop show. And the following month, it was officially announced that Joss Whedon, who was of course in charge and directed Marvel's The Avengers, and was the creator of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Angel, and Firefly, would be developing this Untitled series for Marvel Television. And in August of 2012, ABC ordered the official series named S.H.I.E.L.D. to be written by Joss Whedon and Jed Whedon. And Disney CEO Bob Iger actually greenlit the series after watching the Marvel one-shot Item 47, which was featured on Avengers on Blu-ray and DVD. Months would go by, and in April of 2013, ABC officially announced that the series would be titled Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and it was officially picked up for a full season 22-episode order in May of 2013. From then, every May the series would go on to be renewed for a second, third, and fourth season. Now, from day one, it was officially announced that the series would not be about the superheroes, it was going to be about the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and their adventures being just normal people surrounded by the superhuman element. The show was going to be more like a Marvel version of the X-Files or Fringe, where we would see the freak of the week, but it would tie into an overarching story. And one of the big factors that they wanted to make sure was prominent in the TV series was the fact that it could be watched by comic book and non-comic book fans, but that it was rewarding for those that have been watching everything that the MCU has been doing to date. And of course, due to the television side and film side being all under the Disney branch, the TV series could benefit from knowing where the movies were going to go next. And this can be seen reflected throughout the series, such as the use of an enhancement of the Extremis serum, to of course one of the major plot points that was involved in Captain America the Winter Soldier, which actually revealed that Hydra has been infiltrating the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. the entire time. And of course the third and fourth season's use and the subsequent arrival of the Inhumans. Now, when it came to the casting, one thing was announced on day one, and that was the fact that Agent Coulson, played by Clark Gregg, would be the star of the show and returning to reprise his role from the dead. And of course, how that was handled, they said you would have to watch the TV series to find out how a person that died can come back to the realm of the living. And this is when various theories started to take over onto the internet. Was he in fact going to be Marvel's version of Vision? Was he in fact a life model decoy, which was mentioned in the Avengers, or something else? And of course, additional casting would be done in the subsequent months. Ming-Na Wen was cast as Melinda May. We also had Brett Delton cast as Grant Ward, and Chloe Bennett was chosen among more than 400 actresses auditioning to play the role of Skye. She won that role, and in season 3 she would permanently go on to be known as Daisy. And throughout the seasons, various other actors have joined in. Adrian Palicki, of course, joined as Mockingbird. And most recently in the 4th season, Gabriel Luna joined as Robbie Reyes, aka the Ghost Rider. Now, this series is also known for filming in various locations around the world. The majority of the pilot took place in Los Angeles to be able to accommodate Joss Whedon and his working schedule. And ever since the first episode, we've seen various locations from around the world. Paris, France, Sweden, Puerto Rico, and various other countries are all shot on location. Now, given that this is a television series, the special effects does have to be toned down compared to the movie, and the typical season, which consists of close to 18 hours, consists of only 2,000 visual effects, which is of course a far cry from the 2,200 visual effects that a movie like The Avengers has to use in only 2 hours. The soundtrack and the music is composed by Bear McCreary, who is by many known as the John Williams of TV music, and at an average he composes about 30 minutes of music per episode. Now when it comes to the review scores, the average Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. episode has an aggregate of an 8 out of a 10 or an 82% if you go by Rotten Tomatoes. And the series has largely been accepted as improving every season since its initial release, with many noting that the second season in particular is one of the best on TV among superheroes. Now, as Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. does serve as a backbone to the entirety of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, obviously throughout the seasons you are going to see major connections that play in line with the movies. Now, while there are a certain amount of people that see this as a disadvantage to the series because it has to adhere to what is happening in the rest of the movie universe, there are those of us who actually see this as a major benefit to being able to expand what is happening with the characters. For example, the first half of the first season of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is relatively slow up until it picks up pace when it ties up with Captain America the Winter Soldier, which is of course the major revelation that Hydra was in fact the one infiltrating the organization. But this would actually later come on to be expanded by in the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. when it was revealed that Hydra was actually founded way back in the day by an actual Inhuman, which is something that they're doing that the movies have not even touched yet. Now, of course, in Season 1, we would also be able to find out what exactly was happening with Agent Coulson, which would sort of drag on into Season 2, but inevitably we found out that he was brought back due to a serum that was from a Kree, which of course directly tied it into Guardians of the Galaxy. Now, of course, transitioning on into the second season, we would actually see some powered people debut in form of the Inhumans. Now, the Inhumans movie is still slated to come out in about 5 to 6 years, so they definitely have a jump on them in that term. But of course, the second season largely dealing with the Inhumans, we actually got to find out their back history, how they've kind of been around on Earth for a little bit of time, and what exactly is their agenda. And of course, with the major factor of this still being the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. working in the backdrop of the Avengers, we actually get to find out that the reason that the whole Theta Protocol is happening and the reason that Nick Fury shows up with a helicarrier in Avengers Age of Ultron is mainly due to what the agents were doing in the backs, kind of playing it low and still trying to hide where they are while they were chasing some of the Hydra goons that were still left over. Then, of course, in the third season, this was pretty much Inhumans the series. Overall, they went further into the history, of course, even going as far as to strand one of the members onto their own planet, which to this day is the highest rated episode of the series and has actually went on and won awards. And this was of course another way that they could tie up some loose ends with such characters as Agent Ward, who actually ended up becoming the Inhuman Hive. And then there is of course the fourth season, which is currently still underway and at the time of this recording has only been 3 episodes in, which of course brought us the debut of the magical side of the MCU, and of course as of right now the Ghost Rider is playing a major part. Now, one of the many parts that has went into Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is of course the Inhumans, mainly due to some of the factors I talked about before with Marvel having to sell off certain characters and not owning the mutants anymore. The Inhumans are their way of telling the similar stories but having a slight twist on them, and of course expanding upon what has been said in the movies, where Captain America Civil War can only briefly touch upon the registration and the actual Sokovia Accords, which are dealt with registrations of people with powers. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. the TV series can actually manage to delve deep into that, such as seeing split factions of Inhumans and people that are out to hunt them working either on behalf of the government or being some sort of crime shadow organization. Now, due to the success of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Marvel's continuing partnership with ABC, they were able to pitch this series as one that would begin the huge takeover of Marvel on TV, specifically Netflix. So join me next time as we take a look at 2 movies that would inevitably end up dividing up the fan base amongst Marvel fanatics. Hey guys, Armin here, just reminding you that this video was made possible thanks to patrons. If you guys are interested in supporting us and making sure we keep the lights on, check out our Patreon where you can join other fans in supporting the CBC delivering content you guys have come to love and expect. And if you can't do that, give us a like and a subscribe. That goes a long way too.